I think it's so beautiful that we've had the opportunity here to watch a birth happen in real time and the foster family expand. And I couldn't help noticing that Michael's face, to me, it looks I wonder if he caught his baby or if he actually delivered his baby, because his face looks exactly like I think mine did when my youngest was born, and I actually, caught her, because the midwife did not make it in time. My wife is very fast at that, so a little bit traumatizing, but I'm no worse for wear in the end. Today I want to ask a simple question related to this topic, and that is, what are children for? And I want to start with a sketch of two ideas of the good life. Comedian Jim Gaffigan is a favorite in my household. Among his best are routines about Disney World. And since I am a Floridian, I deeply relate to his impression of just how weird this subtropical entertainment empire is. Recounting his own vacation planning process, Gaffigan asks, "How can I spend an enormous amount of money, be uncomfortable, and listen to my children complain and whine?" The answer, of course, is that great transmogrified cow pasture, now the world's craziest urban sprawl and hub of consumerism, junk food, and day drinking we affectionately call Orlando. Gaffigan also frequently jokes about his family and his 5 children. And when people find out that he has that many children, and that at one point they all lived with him and his wife in a 2-bedroom apartment in New York City, Gaffigan summarizes the response as, "Well, that's one way to live your life." Implied is that there are other, better, smarter ways to live one's life. Gaffigan's brood may be a cornucopia of comedy material, but is it a good life? Many other celebrities and comedians don't seem to think so. Recently, actor Seth Rogen went viral for an interview in which he explains why he's happy that he and his wife don't have children. As Rogen told the Diary of a CEO host, Stephen Bartlett, "A lot of people have kids before they even think about it, from what I've seen. Me and my wife, neither of us were like that. Honestly, the older we get, the more happy and reaffirmed we are with our choice not to have kids. We are in the prime of our lives. We're smarter than we've ever been. We understand ourselves more than we ever have. We're effing psyched all the time. We're laying in bed on Saturday mornings, smoking weed, watching movies naked. If we had kids, we could not be doing any of this." What a pity. We don't have to raise a child, he says, which the world does not need right now. Rogen here is painting his own picture of the good life and arguing that not having children has been crucial to he and his wife reaching that goal. If we surveyed Americans, in fact, parents across the entire developed world, on whether they're aiming for Gaffigan's family life or Rogen's family life, there's little doubt that more with each passing year are choosing the career and cannabis over the cradle, the hedonism over the household, the fun over the family. Writing at First Things not long ago, our friend Pastor Kevin DeYoung, who found himself, I can only assume, in the right mood, critiqued this modern ambivalence toward childbearing. He observed that the paradigmatic affliction of the Old Testament, barrenness, is now the desire of nations. And he's right. Outside of Africa, birth rates worldwide are reaching historic lows. Italy, Spain, Portugal, Thailand, and South Korea will lose half of their populations by the end of this century. Europe will shed some 250 million people by the same time. 250 million. The BBC reports that within 75 years, virtually every single country on the planet will have a shrinking population. It's really not possible to explain this demographic bottoming out as the result of changing technology or a changing economy. As sociologist Lyman Stone recently remarked, the U.S. had replacement rate fertility, which is about 2.1 children on average per woman, as recently as 2007. That's the year I graduated high school, by the way. I know it doesn't look like that, but it's been a while. Today, that has fallen to 1.6 per woman, well below replacement rate. To put that in perspective, nothing in our entire national past, not world wars, not the Great Depression, and not pandemics, a lot more deadly than COVID-19, has resulted in birth rates this low for this long. And when polled by Pew Research, a growing share of childless adults say that they're probably never going to have kids. I just shared on Twitter a graph from Deseret News that shows the share of married people with kids, married Americans with kids, going like this, and the share of unmarried Americans without kids going like this. And they've now crossed over, and the majority, or the plurality, are the unmarried without kids between 18 and 55. If it's not the economy, stupid, then what is it? What's driving birth rates down so rapidly that we're seeing the long-term viability of our country jeopardized? A viability that we had just a few years ago when I graduated high school, but now we're headed for senility and a population crash. Well, according to poll after poll and study after study, people in affluent, developed nations just don't want kids anymore. One Pew poll I cited at World a while back tells it all. When asked why they haven't had children, adults in my age cohort ranked financial barriers, the thing often blamed for their childness in the media, at a distant third. A majority said that the top reason that they haven't had kids is that they simply don't want them. Hillary Hoffauer, writing at Business Insider, hit the nail on the head. She said, millennial women who are now in their prime childbearing years have normalized the idea of choice, and their choice reflects a calculation that having children just is not worth it. Again, we have to ask at this point, what's the cause of this lack of desire? Writing last year at The Spectator, British journalist Louise Perry claimed that something about late modernity itself is making us voluntarily sterile. She writes, what we are now discovering is that at the population level, modernity selects systematically against itself. The key features of modernity, urbanism, affluence, secularism, the blurring of gender distinctions, and more time spent with strangers than with kin, all of these factors in combination shred fertility. Which means that progressivism, the political ideology that urges on the acceleration of modernization, can be best understood as a sterility meme. When people first became modern, they have fewer children. When they adopt progressive ideology, they accelerate the process of modernization, and so have even fewer. Today, she concludes, only 3% of the world's population lives in a country whose fertility rate is not declining. If you take Rogan's view that the world doesn't need any more children and life without them is better, I guess this is great news. If, however, you live in a part of the world, if, however, you live in the real world and you can do math and you don't tell people that you sleep naked, you understand the rather obvious fact that not everybody, or even most people, can go on living like this. As Whitney Houston once astutely observed, the children are our future. What will happen if that future is never born? Novelist P.D. James took a stab at answering this in her 1992 dystopian masterpiece, Children of Men, in which the women of the world have all become mysteriously infertile. The outcome, as you can also see in the film version, is global chaos and despair. Now, this is science fiction, but we can see glimpses of the same trends in the real world. Countries like Japan, whose population is now falling by about 1 million people per year, offer a preview of what an aging and shrinking society looks like. 1 in 4 Japanese citizens is over the age of 65. Partly as a result of this, Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world and an upside-down social security system. Simply put, there are too few young people to support all the old people. And the young ones have gotten the message. They're lonely, they're isolated, they're losing hope for the future and committing suicide in historic numbers. If you haven't heard of the suicide forest at the foot of Mount Fuji National Park in Japan, I don't necessarily advise looking it up on Google Images, but it's a pretty chilling phenomenon that is apparently unique to that part of the world. Yet it's not actually early life where things are the ugliest. It's late life. Many Japanese seniors now die alone and are only found because of the smell. So many suffer this fate that there's now a word for it, kodokushi, or lonely deaths. And a new industry has sprung up for cleaning and disinfecting kodokushi apartments. Worst of all, this societal sickness gets harder to reverse the longer it progresses. The Financial Times describes how a lack of children tends to trigger a vicious cycle in which low fertility in one generation causes lower fertility in the next, leading to a downward spiral in population. There are, as it turns out, no known examples of a country falling below replacement rate for more than a year or two and ever recovering. We often imagine that because we currently have a planet populated by 8 billion people, that a children of men-like scenario is just impossible. It just could never happen. But as the BBC reported in 2020, Japan is just one of dozens of countries around the world due for, and this is their phrase, jaw-dropping population crashes in the near future. Not because of a mysterious disease, but because of millions upon millions of individual choices to live for today and ignore tomorrow. Droves of adults of childbearing age in this country right now are telling themselves they'll get around to it eventually, after they've sorted out their education, built a career, and one day maybe found a spouse. But demographically, the hour is late. The oldest millennials turned 40 in 2021. The youngest are approaching 30. For women, obviously, fertility begins to decline in the late 20s and drops off sharply after about 35. In other words, millennials are now exiting their prime childbearing years. By the time some decide to have children, they might not actually be able to. And they don't seem terribly aware of this biological fact. Author Kira Davis wrote on X, formerly known as Twitter, this month, "I spoke to a 35-year-old unmarried female relative recently. She is seeing someone..." Stop. There we go. She's seeing someone, and they're considering marriage, but she says she's taking it slow. I asked her if she wanted to have children. She said, yes, 4. I told her she's too old for taking it slow if she wants 4 children. And at this age, she'll be lucky to have a couple after an engagement, wedding, and honeymoon period has passed. Not to mention the time it actually takes to grow and birth a baby. Davis continues, people aren't being honest with young women about their bodies and timelines. Has anyone ever told you that your prime childbearing years are over? Has anyone ever talked to you about how aging changes your fertility? This young woman said, no one. Not one person. She hadn't thought about it until I mentioned it. Not me, Davis. She didn't realize she didn't have all the time in the world. A while back, I got in trouble for pointing this out on Twitter. I wrote this: millennials who are very cavalier about not having children are in for a shock when they enter their 40s and realize that life is only half over. What do you do at that point? Keep trying to be sexy and have fun? I expect to see a lot of sadness and confusion about what to do at that point. After my tweet went viral, tens of thousands of angry commenters, most of them fellow millennials, assured me that having fun and being sexy are perfectly viable priorities for the second half of life. If you've ever been to Florida, you know this is not the case. Besides, the planet is overpopulated, the economy is terrible, and climate change means children will face an uncertain future. Why bring more people into such a miserable world just so I can have company in my old age? Well, it's a fascinating question, in part because if prior generations who went through far worse things than we do had answered it the way this generation is answering it, a lot of us would not exist. Set aside all the trendy excuses about the economy and climate, and even the party life that comedian Chelsea Handler recommended in her video response to me. And something else begins to seep through. You can sense a bone-deep nihilism, an attitude that life is not worth passing on, that enjoying the present is all that really matters, and that we have no duty to those who came before or will come after us. Millions have bought into this attitude and are so busy pursuing our culture's version of the good life that they've forgotten to pass on life. At this point, I need to deal with an objection that inevitably comes up right about now. It has long been popular in evangelical blogging and publishing to warn against the idolatry of marriage and family. In 2018, Christianity Today asked, do Christians focus too much on the family? Cornerstones for Parents offers 10 signs your kids have become an idol. An article at the Center for Faith and Culture says, parents, stop idolizing your children. And Boundless, a publication of Focus on the Family, describes what to look for when marriage becomes an idol. So, there must be a fire with this much smoke. Are we really in grave peril of idolizing the family? Well, here I often invoke a witty passage from C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, in which the hellish undersecretary instructs his nephew to direct the fashionable outcry of each generation against those vices of which it is least in danger, and fix its approval on the virtue nearest to that vice which we are trying to make endemic. The game is to have all the humans running about with fire extinguishers whenever there is a flood, and all crowding to that side of the boat which is already nearly gunwale under. I don't doubt that there are subcultures out there where family takes the place of the faith, and matrimony the place of the master. It really is possible to idolize marriage and children. Mormons are probably an example of what this looks like. But given the statistics we've just poured over, we need to ask, which error is endemic to our society and our churches? Are we primarily in danger in 2024 of perishing in an inferno of baby worship? Or drowning in a flood of deified dogs and cats? On one level, to ask is to answer. On another, it's devilishly difficult. Because the more entangled we as a culture become in the error of our age, the more motivated we become to portray it as a virtue and to portray the opposite as idolatry. My conclusion is that our collective idols are not hiding behind the home and the hearth. Even in the church, our idols are usually now of the opposite sort. You can expose them even in casual conversation. As one Anglican priest and friend of mine observed, young, healthy, married Christian couples are often upset when older church members or relatives expect them to have multiple children. In his words, if you pastorally poke this bear, you often find lurking just below the surface a worship of mammon, or even a hopelessness that deeply questions the value and meaning of human existence. Idols of gold, all. Of course, one of the chief of those idols is one so firmly enthroned and lavishly celebrated in our time that its claim of deity goes largely unnoticed, even among many evangelicals. I'm talking about the idea that sex and our sexual bodies are mainly for self-expression and having fun. My boss, John Stonestreet, tells of a repeated experience he had leading summer classes for high schoolers at Summit. John would ask marriage-minded students about their intentions to have children with their future spouse. The question, he says, often baffled them. Children, they'd say. Well, we just want to get married. We can think about children later. Some said they didn't even want to have children. They just wanted to get married. Then you shouldn't get married, replied John. And this response was often met with anger and confusion. even a spirited defiance that John had unbiblically bound people's consciences. Now, don't misunderstand. Children don't make a marriage. But the idea that intentional childlessness in marriage is an option, or that sex can reliably be had without producing babies, are both surprisingly new. They are not the result of a discovery about human physiology, a philosophical argument, or even a moral revolution, so much as they are the aftermath of an incredibly powerful little pill. We have this modern conceit that our great-grandparents were prudes with their modesty standards and shotgun weddings and overprotective fathers. Let me be the first to break this to you. They were not. Sex made babies back then. Do we really understand that statement? For many today, shacking up is as casual an activity as going out for dinner. But in generations past, to even think of fooling around with a member of the opposite sex was to invite a cascade of life-altering events. We've forgotten this because the spell of contraception has so altered our worldview that we no longer understand even our own bodies. Listen to the strange way we speak. When young people today, even in church, say they're not sure they want kids, they're almost never saying they're not sure they want sex. They want that. What they're actually saying is that they want to chemically isolate the very beginning of the human reproductive cycle so they can dwell in maximal gratification indefinitely while pursuing idealized middle-class hobbies and status symbols. They just need the right roommate to join them. And thanks to the pill and the cultural revolution it sparked, all of this seems perfectly normal in the modern world. Yet it's a house of cards held up by the heavy hand of pharmaceutical intervention. For almost all of human history, the choice was very simple: celibacy or babies. And you know what? Those limits were very good for us in important ways. Marriage and exclusivity flowed naturally out of those limits, together with a culturally appropriate set of gender roles. Marriage is not arbitrary, guys. It is, in part, a logical conclusion drawn from the two facts that adults, especially men, want sex, and that sex makes babies who must be raised, fed, clothed, taught, and loved for decades. These rituals of protecting daughters' virtue and requiring sons to demonstrate their providing abilities and giving daughters away at weddings are fitted deeply into the grooves of human nature and have honed us for thousands of years. Yet in the last few decades, the sheer fact of birth control has thrown us out of those grooves into a world of spiritual, social, and sexual chaos. In her book, The Genesis of Gender, former feminist Abigail Favale summarizes our situation. She writes, "In our imagination, reproduction has receded into the background. Our procreative capacities are seen as incidental to manhood and womanhood, rather than an integral aspect, indeed, the defining feature of those very identities. We live and move and have our trysts in a contraceptive society where the visible sexual markers of our bodies are no longer gesture toward new life, but signal the prospect of sterile pleasure. Should a woman build a career or be a mom? What city will she live in? How much education will she pursue? Should she date around or settle down and get married? How many kids should she have? What standard of living does she demand? What will her work-home balance be like with her partner? Take away the drugs and devices used to artificially suppress the female reproductive system, and a surprising number of these questions simply answer themselves. People's whole mental landscape about sex changes when you do that, because it's no longer a self-expressive game. It's the origin of life. The tie between sex and babies has shaped our households, our clans, our clothes, our legal system, our economies, our nations, our civilization, our psyches. And in about a single generation, we broke that tie. One of the consequences is the closing, not just of wombs, but of hearts to new life. Yet just as the heavens proclaim the glory of God, our bodies still, despite our tampering, proclaim the purposes of God for the human race in this world and beyond, no matter how many pills we pop. And I do mean in this world and beyond. Did you know that in the late 1970s, when NASA sent the Pioneer spacecrafts to fly beyond our solar system into the depths of space, they included 2 metal plaques engraved with a naked man and woman side by side? You know why? It was to show hypothetical extraterrestrials what our species looks like should they find the probes. I like to imagine those extraterrestrials, perhaps good angels, oblivious to what has transpired on Earth, like the Eldila in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, gazing at those plaques in the crystalline heavens and asking themselves, what do these creatures look so similar yet different for? What's going on there? Why do they each have distinct bodies, crafted with distinct bone structures and musculatures and facial features, height, shape, chests and groins? Why does one come equipped with more body fat? And could they also be different on the inside? Could there be whole systems and organs distinct to each of the 2 types of this critter? Could even their chromosomes look different? And why do they seem to have anatomical features that lack an apparent purpose by themselves, but which fit together like pieces of a puzzle? What on earth is Mel-Eldil up to? The answer, of course, is children. And if angels unfamiliar with the birds and the bees do come across our Voyager space probes, the origin of new human beings may indeed strike them as a great mystery. Yet if we're going to put ourselves in the place of those inquiring extraterrestrials, we need to ask the next question they would naturally ask on hearing all this about how humans make children. Well, okay, what are children for? I think there are really 4 answers. First of all, children are for God. To call this countercultural in 21st century America is a mind-puckering understatement. As a matter of fact, understanding this first and most basic purpose of new little humans requires us to thoroughly rethink our inherited values, our individual priorities, and even our very sense of self. I've gotten a lot of help with this from a book called Rethink Yourself by my friend Trevin Wax. I interviewed Trevin about it a while back on the Colson Center's Upstream podcast, and to this day, it is one of my top recommendations for young people. The premise is really simple. There are 3 basic ways of forming and expressing selfhood, and the way we do it in this culture is by far the weirdest. You see, in the modern West, we do this strange thing where we look inward to discover who we are. Think of the moral lessons in the end of every Disney movie. All you needed all along was right here in your heart. Now, after we've appointed our hearts as our moral masters, we then look around, seeking to express our identities and conform traditions, institutions, relationships, and even the law to our inner sense of self. This is why we prize authenticity as a culture. To fail to do so would be to betray who you truly are within, which is the highest form of treason. Finally, and almost as an afterthought, we look up, often to deify our internal sense of self with a spirituality that endorses our chosen identity. And this profoundly affects theology. It's how you get statements like, the God I believe in would never tell me who I can and can't love. Notice who's on the throne of the universe in that statement. For most of time and throughout much of the world, people have taken a very different approach to discovering themselves. They first looked around them at their culture, their nation, their family, or caste to determine who they should be. If your dad was a farmer, you were a farmer. If your village was Hindu, you were Hindu. Simple as that. Persons in such collectivist societies then looked up to discern the spiritual order that sanctioned and enriched this social order and helped them to understand why it all mattered. Finally, and almost as an afterthought, They looked within to discover how they fit into this world. Now, Wax doesn't think either of these two methods is the right one. He proposes instead a third way of understanding selfhood and argues that it is the biblically and historically Christian way. It begins by looking up to the God who made us and paying attention to what he says about us, then around to discover our place in his world and the relationships in which he has put us. And finally, though not as an afterthought, we look inward to conform ourselves to those two truths and discern our unique place within a reality that does not orbit around us. Now, what does all this have to do with children? Well, it's obvious where Seth Rogen is looking first in his life. And it's equally obvious where, say, a secular college student in Beijing who finds herself pregnant is looking first. Their answers are different, but neither has the order of self-discovery right. But when we first look up, then around, then finally in, we discover some remarkable things about ourselves and about children. For starters, we discover that children are not inconveniences to be terminated or pawned off or consumer goods to be manufactured and sold, but creatures made in God's image. They have certain God-like qualities. They have their own wills, their own abilities and talents, their own distinct genius. They may even end up being smarter, stronger, or more virtuous than us. They may someday judge and reject what their parents believe. They are, in fact, responsible moral agents, answerable ultimately not to you and me, but to the one who made them. They belong first and foremost to him whose image they bear. In biblical terms, being made in God's image is a concept of inexhaustible richness. And one of the things it likely means is that human beings, our children, are the crown of creation. They are vice regents under God, created a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned with glory and honor. They are intended to govern and steward and beautify creation in ways that honor their God. They are natural masters of everything around them, uniquely suited among all the creatures to represent and exercise God's authority and to manipulate, order, develop, and glorify their surroundings. Children enter our world, in other words, as rulers, as royalty. Have you ever noticed the strangest part of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It's not the talking animals or the Christmasless winter. It's not the magic or the quirky inclusions of things from our world, like lampposts and Turkish delight, which isn't half as good as I expected, by the way. It's not even the interdimensional travel through a coat closet. No, what's strangest of all is the fact that when 4 English school children arrive in Narnia, every creature there immediately recognizes them as kings and queens. Next time you read it, watch for this theme. It's everywhere. Even the enemy knows these kids are royalty. There are thrones waiting for them in a castle by the sea. Woodland creatures whisper prophecies that Narnia won't be right until sons and daughters of Adam and Eve rule it. The witch herself bases her claim to rule on the lie that she too is human. In a human child who walks into your life, just as when Lucy walked into Narnia, you have something so excellent in its potential that it can corrupt or save nations. He or she can twist the universe out of shape or set it in some way right again. This child can turn the world around him or her into a hell or a garden. But remember, these royal creatures are vice regents. They rule under a higher authority. And that means that even more fundamental than gardening, children's job in this world is worship. This is why the Pevensies, well, 3 of them anyway, immediately recognize Aslan as the one who gave them their royal titles. That need to worship someone or something outside of yourself is the most fundamental fact about children, and therefore about us. Worship is something we instinctively, even inevitably do. Its pull is probably irresistible, like hunger and thirst. And though our sin constantly draws us toward worshiping the wrong things, God has filled his world with signs that the thing we should be worshiping is not in here. Have you ever walked out alone on a beach just after the passing of a thunderstorm? Have you ever watched the sun rise over the mountains? Have you ever seen a baby born or caught a baby? If you have, you probably know that tug deep inside to give thanks to someone. Andrew Peterson has this magnificent song. It's like my favorite that he's ever done. It's called "Don't You Want to Thank Someone?" And it appeals to this stubborn sense, even in unbelievers, that what they're made for is worship. He sings, "Don't you ever wonder why, in spite of all that's wrong here, there's still so much that goes so right and beauty abounds? Because sometimes when you walk outside, the air is full of song here. The thunder rolls and the baby sighs and the rain comes down. And when you see the spring has come and it warms you like a mother's kiss, don't you want to thank someone? Don't you want to thank someone for this?" One of the things we must recognize as Christian parents, present or future, members of churches in a culture failing to ask what children are for, is that this impulse to worship is at the heart of who we are as a species. We are creation contemplating itself and its creator. And deep down inside, we are all born knowing this. It takes a lot of self-delusion to forget it or to direct that impulse at something as obviously unworthy as the person you meet in the mirror every morning, which is probably why inward-looking cultures are very rare historically. In a different chronicle, The Magician's Nephew, Aslan tells Diggory, "You come of the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve, and that is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. Be content." This paradox of being born sinners with a royal calling makes this question, what are children for, much more urgent. Because you see, children are born with the highest possible purpose. But the higher the intended purpose of something, the worse it can go wrong. If you'll forgive me for continually quoting Lewis. He gave a sermon called "The Weight of Glory." And in it are these haunting lines. "It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption, such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other toward one or other of these destinations. It is in light of these overwhelming possibilities that we should conduct all of our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours but the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, exploit, and we might add, give birth to and parent. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Raising such beings is no trivial matter." The second answer to our question, now that we know they are for God, is simple yet profound. Children are for us. Author and psychologist Jordan Peterson says this: "I do believe it's very hard for people to grow up if they don't have children. And people hate it when I say that, because there are other ways of growing up, but it's very hard. And the reason it's hard is because you're not mature until someone else clearly matters more than you do. And if you aren't narcissistic beyond redemption, that definitely happens to you when you have children. And then you're an adult, even if you're not that good at it. As long as that other person is now something you would die for, or something you would live for, then you're an adult." I don't know about you all, but I never used to cry while reading books or watching movies before I had kids. Now, I can barely get through Wreck-It Ralph. I was a mess trying to read Narnia aloud to my children. I mean, it was hopeless. My oldest daughter, Astrid, long ago picked up on this fact, and she likes to tease me about it. She'll look over at me during a tender scene in a movie or books, or even a poignant moment in a musical score, and say, "Aw, Daddy, do I see a little tear?" There's something about having kids that deepens your emotional life and your experience of the world. Things mean more than they did before. You sympathize more deeply than you once did. Pain and evil frighten you as they never did before. But love and beauty also move you as never before. I think part of it has to do with the way that children draw us out of ourselves and make us care again about the fate of others and of God's world. They make us into adults because they force us to admit that something else matters more than our stupid selves. Children do this because they are living testaments that the future is a place worth inhabiting. They give adults a reason to care about what happens after we're dead. And they stubbornly raise our eyes to values higher than mere self-gratification. They motivate us to build institutions and traditions instead of pleasure palaces, to think in centuries instead of decades, to invest instead of spend. Children also remind us that we ourselves were once dependent, the products of risks and sacrifices by those who came before us, that no one is truly self-sufficient, no one is truly an island. We see ourselves in them, and we realize the only reason we know who we are is because we know whose we are. To borrow a great line from Katie Faust. We are not mere individuals. We are mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, husbands, and wives. We exist in relationship, because of relationship, and for relationship. The moment we are born, we fall into the arms of people, often literally, who didn't choose us, and receive care from them we didn't earn. Children even teach us something of God's own life by embodying something of what it is to beget another. They inspire patience, compassion, and selfless love. And learning all this is profoundly good for us. It grows our souls. It steadies our bones. It causes men in particular to live longer lives. Honestly, if having children weren't something God gives away free of charge, I'd expect to have to pay someone for the good it's done me. It shouldn't surprise us then that parents almost never say they regret having children. A YouGov poll found that just 8% of parents experience birther's remorse. By contrast, nearly 30% of parents, even today, say they wish they'd had more children. And the booming fertility industry testifies that those who wait until it's too late often regret their choice. The priorities many of the proudly child-free tout, whether it's hobbies, hedonism, or having lots of disposable income, turn out to be largely irrelevant to people's sense that their lives have meaning, as one study published in the Journal of Positive Psychology put it. And meaning is the thing you really want to pursue in life. As Paul Bloom wrote 2 years ago in The Atlantic, meaning is a different animal from mere happiness, or what researchers call hedonic pleasure. Meaning is associated with a focus on relationships between past and future, rather than just now, the present. It is long-lasting, not fleeting. It derives from giving, not from taking. And it involves stress and challenges, not just ease and convenience. For those of us raising kids, all of this is a familiar job description. What's even more amazing is that God not only blesses us through our children, but has blessed the parent-child relationship itself by using it as one of his chief means for saving the world. Think, for instance, about Abraham and Sarah and what Isaac was to them. This child wasn't just an answer to a barren couple's prayer. He was the fulfillment of a promise that would echo down through the Bible. All those stars and grains of sand symbolize descendants Abraham would gain through this one boy. And the New Testament makes it clear that these weren't just physical descendants. No, Isaac embodied a promise that Abraham would inherit the world and its nations by faith. If you get right down to it, you could summarize the whole Bible as the story of God making a new human race to answer the prayer of an infertile couple. And that's not even the greatest gift God's ever given us through a child. When he set out to accomplish redemption itself, he did so not by descending from the sky like some kind of Superman, but by entering a girl's womb and becoming a baby. In other words, the world was saved not in spite of childbearing, but through it. Salvation itself was accomplished by means of that ancient pattern God set up in Eden. And in the climactic act, he himself entered the play. Today, our families and children are one of the main ways God adds to Abraham's family. One of the main strategies he uses to grow his kingdom. This is true whether or not you baptize babies, although you should. Merely raising them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord is an act of worship that we know bears eternal fruit more reliably than almost any other method of evangelism. We get this pernicious idea from our culture that we shouldn't indoctrinate our kids, that we should let them grow up and decide what they believe for themselves. And of course, we can't ultimately guarantee their faith or their faithfulness. That's a matter of their freedom and God's grace. But that doesn't mean we should raise them somehow neutral on the most important of all questions. If we wouldn't act uncertain when we teach our kids math, say that 6 times 5 equals 30, why would we qualify our certainty when we teach them that Jesus is risen Lord of heaven and earth? Not to answer children's big who, what, where, why questions is to invite someone else to answer them. God is not ambiguous in Scripture about the calling of Christian parents. It's not to feed and clothe our children just so the world can adopt them. A friend of mine makes a habit of reminding his high school son of his family identity and allegiance before he walks out the door. Remember, son, he says, you are a Stenberg. Wear the name well. I'm trying to do the same thing with my kids. Remember, Astrid, Elijah, Peter, Aubrey, though Aubrey doesn't quite get it yet. You are Morris's. Remember what we taught you. Wear the name well. And I have a right to say that and to expect that of them because they do represent Gabby and me. They were given to us. They are for us. But the reason we do this isn't because we're selfish or egotistical. It's because we ultimately believe that the identity we are passing on to our children as Christians perfectly aligns with their true nature as creatures of God. This path, if they choose to remain on it, will lead to eternal blessedness and splendor and joy. We should be surer of that than of life itself. And that brings us to our third and maybe most surprising answer to our big question, what are children for? Children, I want to suggest, are for themselves. In another line from the Screwtape Letters, surprise, our old devil tutors his nephew on the finer points of selfishness. In the process, he lets slip why it is that God demands we humans love our neighbors as ourselves. You see, writes Screwtape, the enemy wants to kill their animal self-love as soon as possible, but it is his long-term policy, I fear, to restore to them a new kind of self-love, a charity and gratitude for all selves, including their own. When they have really learned to love their neighbor as themselves, they will be allowed to love themselves as their neighbors. For we must never forget what is the most repellent and inexplicable trait in our enemy. He really loves the hairless bipeds he has created, and always gives back to them with his right hand what he has taken away with his left. God demands that we consider others better than ourselves. But that's not because he wants us to hate ourselves. It's because he knows that only by learning to love as he does can our sinful selfishness be transformed into a genuine holy gratitude for how wondrous we as selves among selves really are. What does this mean for kids in Christian households and churches? Well, simple. It means we want them to love themselves with the truest, sincerest, most godlike love possible. We want them to rejoice in the vast potential their Creator has built into them and is calling out of them. And we want them to know true freedom, not just freedom from, which is what our culture is obsessed with, but freedom for right relationship with God and neighbor, for embracing their created sexuality, for expressing their ideas competently and persuasively, for living from top to bottom according to what they know to be true about Christ, about the world, and about themselves, and to lead others to do the same. My kids go to a classical Christian school where there's a strong emphasis on exactly this type of freedoms. They call it the liberal arts, a term that's gotten a very bad rap lately. In the ancient context, the term liberal was meant to distinguish them from the servile arts, to signify that these are the things which free men think about. Not for their own enjoyment, but so that they can help rule their state. In the Christian context, a liberal education takes on a new depth of meaning. Yes, we're educating rulers, not only of city-states, but of countries and of God's world. And we free them, not by demanding of them something alien to their natures, but by bringing out the wondrous potential that is already latent in them, and pointing them without rest to the cross of the Savior who can redeem and glorify all that potential. In other words, the goal of this sort of education is to help children become more truly and fully themselves. The Westminster Shorter Catechism says that man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. This idea comes to us through St. Augustine, who famously said that human hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. This is the main point of another of my favorite popular books on theology, John Piper's Desiring God. The central argument of this book is that we don't have to choose between pursuing joy and obeying God, because in Piper's view, they're one and the same. Our deepest and most eternal delight as creatures designed to glorify and enjoy God is actually nothing other than glorifying and enjoying God. This means that we're not just raising children to love the Lord because we want them to share our religion. We're doing so because we believe deep down in the foundation of our souls that knowing and loving and desiring God was what our kids were made for. And when we do this, we are guiding them to the highest possible joy, flourishing, and happiness that they can receive. Whoever drinks of this water, Jesus once told a thirsty woman, will never thirst again. What are children for? So that we can guide them to the best possible well, the one we really all desire, even if we don't know it yet. They are here to become what God intended them to be, in a very real and not at all selfish sense. They are for themselves. And now we come to the last answer to that big question. What are children for? And this is where we return to the competing visions of the good life in my opening. Children are for God, they're for us, and they're for themselves. But they're also for the world. This is vital, because if all we've said about the human person and human nature is true, if we really were crafted to worship and find our highest delight in God, if we don't really grow up until someone else matters more than we do, and if meaning itself is found in relationships and always trumps self-centered pleasure, then countless souls in our nation are simply failing to pursue the good life. and are instead eating slop with the pigs. To state the obvious, this is not good for them. In his book, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. I love that title. Sociologist Brad Wilcox discusses why men in particular live longer, earn more over their lifetimes, and achieve greater happiness on average when they get married and have kids. He writes, "Today, ordinary Americans are much more likely to succumb not just to suicide, but also to a host of related maladies, like loneliness, meaninglessness, despair, and drug use, if they are living as bare branches." He tells the story of one such bare branch, Scott O'Sullivan, a 34-year-old military contractor living in Washington, D.C., who is a big success by the standards of today's culture, but whose life is marked by the absence of marriage and family. Scott has gotten a college degree from Clemson University, an engaging career, a house of his own, and a good-sized bank account, as he pulls in more than $100,000 annually. But all of this is not enough. Scott told Wilcox, "You know, I've got degrees on my wall, I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end. It's not like I can take any of that with me after I die. I have to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize that I am alone. I have nobody. I come home, I take my dog out, eat dinner, and I go to bed. And I repeat this 5 days a week. I've got nothing to look forward to. I don't feel like anybody's cheering me on." Wilcox concludes that without the rhythms and routines of marriage and family life and the care and concern of a spouse and children, men like Scott struggle with a toxic mix of loneliness, meaninglessness, and sadness. In the book, he points to research showing that married parents are about half as likely as childless singles to say they're lonely, or about twice as likely to say they're happy, and have a longer average life expectancy. Even on the material front, very much contrary to what influencers like Andrew Tate are telling boys. Stably married men in their 50s end up with an average of, I couldn't believe this, 30 times the financial assets of their never married peers. As much as we can hear hints of Seth Rogen trying to convince himself he really is psyched about life, he's doing far better than the vast majority of people who choose his path. In fact, one of Wilcox's main points in the book is that media, political, and academic elites have lied to Americans about what makes for a good life. He shows just how many of these people publicly preach sexual liberation and freedom from the family while privately living surprisingly traditional lives. Their progressive ideas are what has been called luxury beliefs. They're selling them to tens of millions of Americans who are buying them, and the aftermath is all around us. This is where the children of Christians come in. Literally. We are raising, or will be raising, men and women who will begin to forge their own lives right about the time millions of unattached people my age are realizing the twilight of life is anything but golden when all you've got is a dog to keep you company. Our children will have the potential not only to proclaim the good news of salvation to all these bare branches, but to minister to them with something much more down to earth that they have lost. The human connection and sense of belonging that is so much of what makes life worth living. In the meantime, those who buck the trend of self-pursuit and childlessness will be doing their small part to reverse the demographic and spiritual trends of this culture. Children are, after all, thank you, Whitney Houston, our future. And that means that those who actually bother having them will tend to inherit the future. It's certainly happened before. Writing at Christianity Today, sociologist Lyman Stone made a claim that upset many, including some of CT's staff writers. Stone wrote, "While St. Paul's celibate vocation was of great benefit, Christianity mostly grew in its early centuries via births, marriages, and adoptions, not evangelism classically construed. Early Christian new member classes specifically took pains to teach pagan men to understand their Christian wives' faith. And because Christianity prohibited abortion, infanticide, and early forms of birth control, Christians had much higher birth rates than the pagans. The notion that some Christian singles have that their singleness will be very useful for the gospel, he says, rests on the fundamental assumption that their evangelism as unmarried individuals will be more spiritually fruitful than discipling their children. A very debatable assumption. In almost every generation of Christians, for almost all of history, fertility has been a much bigger source of new believers than adult evangelism. So in the final analysis, cultures are not renewed by legislation. They aren't renewed by social media posts. They aren't renewed by fundraisers, conferences, or even eloquent speeches. They are renewed by durable, real-world communities, especially the local church and families, going out and living what they preach. And they are renewed by those little platoons, countering the lies of the age that cut against the grain of reality, and offering instead a quiet and peaceful life, a simple willingness to live with creation's grain, to ask what human beings in our gendered glory were made for, and to rejoice in our God's very good answer. I leave you with this challenge. Consider that the little ones Jesus welcomed may be a much bigger part of your calling than our culture dares to imagine. Whether you're married or single, young or old, able to have children or led to adoption, consider that you may need to adjust your priorities and planning. Consider that you may need to shake off the diseased influences of people who pretend to be happy and who tell you that children are barriers to having the same good life they do. Consider that the purpose God has for you may be much more closely tied to your gendered body than you think. And consider that marriage, the garden where God intended children to grow, might not be something you can afford to leave as an afterthought. For many, or even most of us in this room, what are children for should be a big part of the answer to the question, what am I for? I say this not only as a challenge, but as an invitation from someone 11 years and 4 little kings and queens into the process, who considers it the bulk of my ministry and calling in this world. It must be a good life, because I would not trade it for the world, guys. Thank you.